Good day, everybody. Glad to be back with you on Hospitality Talks with my co-host, Sam-Erik Ruttmann. Before I pass it on to him, just want to set the stage for today's wonderful conversation. The competitive environment of the business world today, organizations are increasingly aware that their physical and financial assets are not enough alone. There are complex challenges around us all the time, and these challenges require innovation and creativity. Leaders need to understand how to design and guide effective collaborations to accelerate innovation and accelerate change. Designing the right customer experience is about composing an environment of customer engagement opportunities that reinforce brand values and encourage the desired customer behavior. The modern consumers have hundreds, if not thousands, of choices every day. No matter how objective a customer's purchasing process may seem, their analysis is always influenced by their perception of your brand and your company. As customers become more demanding, their expectations for consistent, connected, and personalized experiences is ever growing. I'm Abid Butt, glad to be here with you, and our panelists today will help us better understand the complexities of customer journey and how to best prepare for the challenging environments around us. And again, I'm here with my co-host, Sam-Erik Ruttmann. Sam.
Thank you, Abid. Yes, and warm welcome to everyone for this very exciting session about customer journey. It's so much talked about why is it so difficult for companies to create a good customer journey strategy, and we will try to find out what are the right approaches, or is there a right approach to this, and we have a great panel to help us to understand this better. And if you're joining us live, and we have luminary learning companies here from Vancouver, so great to have you here, and everyone else who's joining, please just put in where you are viewing from, and more importantly, put in some comments and questions. We like to get some little bit of difficult questions for the panelists to answer, because they are experts in their fields. So if it's all right, Abid, let's bring our panels together here in the next scene.
Yes, please do. So, Sam, as you know, we have with us Annette Franz, who's got a long-standing involvement in customer experience profession. She's founder and CEO of CX Journey, a leading consulting service firm that helps clients in a variety of industries. She's also worked on client-side customer experience strategy and is author of Customer Understanding, 3 ways to put the customer in customer experience and at the heart of your business. Today, we also are joined by Ed Morrison, who is director of the Agile Strategy Lab at the University of North Alabama. During his corporate strategy career, he has conducted studies for all different sizes of companies. A quick anecdote about Ed's background: he also worked at the Capitol for a little while, and I'm not sure if it was the government experience or the private sector experience that converted him and frustrated him to go into new methodologies for developing strategies. He has now developed loosely connected networks, which has grown into what is now strategic doing. In 2019, he led a team of people that published a book summarizing this work called Strategic Doing: 10 Skills for Agile Leadership. And last but not least, we have Dr. Peter Ricci, who is Clinical Associate Professor and Director of Hospitality and Tourism Management Program at Florida Atlantic University. Peter has published over 30 peer-reviewed tourism-related journals and articles. He has a book called The Little Book of Big Cases for the Hospitality Manager. But his proudest accomplishment is the HSMAI South Florida Dr. Peter Ricci Scholarship, which has raised over $20,000 since its inception for the students that are undertaking this career. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for your time and thanks for being with us at Hospitality Talks.
Thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely. So, Annette, if it's okay, we're going to start with you right out of the gates.
All right.
Tell us about, what does a successful customer journey look like? What does it really mean?
Yeah, well, it's a really short and simple answer, right? It looks like whatever the customer tells you it looks like, right? I mean, that's really the bottom line. As long as we've help them achieve whatever they're trying to do, solve their problems, address their pain points, ultimately, achieving the jobs they're trying to do, that's a successful journey for them. But they will tell us if it's successful or not. That's the key.
Well, what if we don't speak the same language? Organizations attempt to do that, but at times we fail to understand what is it that the customers are looking for.
Well, then we've got some work to do. Absolutely, we do. We have to take the time. This is why I wrote the book, right? I mean, we do have to take the time to listen to our customers, understand who they are, what their needs are, what their pain points, problems to solve, jobs to be done. We need to really understand them. We also need to understand the experience that they're having today and what their ideal experience looks like. And that's the only way that you're going to speak the same language, is if you take the time to actually do the work.
But why is such a hype about customer centricity, and why is it important to create that culture in organizations? Organizations have been around forever. Why such an importance today?
There's a short answer to that one too, and then I'll give the longer answer. The short answer is, without customers, we have no business, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. So who are we in business for? Who are we creating products for, if it's not for the customer? And so that's why it's so important to be customer centric. There's a saying out there that you need to find products for your customers, not customers for your products. And there are so many organizations that do just that. They find customers for their products instead of products for their customers. And that's the wrong mindset, right? We really do have to put the customer at the center of everything that we do. And when we do, first of all, I want to step back and say that the employee and the employee experience, we've got to put them more first, right? Because the employee experience drives the customer experience. That's a critical part to being a customer-centric organization, is to have, the employee put more first. And probably a better way to even describe it is to be people-centric. And when we do that, there really are, what I call human benefits, and there are business benefits, right? So for the people, both for the employee and for the customer, what ends up happening is they feel valued, they feel heard, they feel listened to. We solve problems for them. We end up, because we're doing all this work, we're innovating and creating new products and new services that ultimately lead to the business benefits as well, which are, the growth and the increase in revenue, profit, retention, all of those key outcomes that businesses are looking for as well. Even competitive advantage, right? I always like to say that, in a world where the products and services are becoming more and more commoditized, customer experience is that one true differentiator. And it's not just a fluff saying. I actually have clients who are coming to me and saying, hey, we're doing great in our, in our marketplace or wherever, where we are. But we know that if we have a better customer experience, we'll one up our competitors. And so that's what we want to focus on. So it's such an important, thing to focus on for the business, because the outcomes are real.
Well, Annette, what do you say to the people in the organizations that talk about the customer is very finicky? You can never make them happy, and bring that to today's environment. Please talk about some of the trends and challenges in how customer expectations are developing.
Yeah, well, the customer is the customer, right? So you've got to remember that. Customer is not always right, but they are the customer. And so we do need to, again, it does really come down to taking the time to listen to them and understand what their needs and expectations are about the experience. And so as we've gone through the last year and a half or so, the emerging trends and the things that customers want and their expectations have evolved as well. Maybe some of the things were things that customers expected prior to COVID and prior to the pandemic, but now they stick. Right now, these are things that they want to continue. So we're looking at convenience and contactless and simple and fast and instant gratification. Right, there's effortless and frictionless and all of these things that happened to bubble up to the top for the customers in the last year and a half that they expect to continue having over the rest of their experience with the brand. So those are things. And again, every brand, every industry, every customer has different expectations about the experience. So you actually have to listen to your customers and find out what their expectations are, find out what the emerging trends are for them. What's interesting, what happened during the pandemic early on was a lot of my friends who are customer experience professionals got laid off. And then suddenly they either got rehired or hired somewhere else pretty quickly because executives realized we need customer insights. We need to understand, why are they hoarding toilet paper or whatever it is that they're buying? What do customers need from us right now? And so again, that's another trend that I hope continues, because as customer experience professionals, we struggled a lot with that before that, trying to sell our executives on the ROI of delivering a great customer experience. And I think there were a lot of lessons learned in the last year or so.
Well, you have already talked about some of the elements that go into engaging with the customer. But if you were to pick, let's say, top five, what drives that engagement? What would you say that would be? And not necessarily for hospitality, but generally speaking, what can we do? What are the top five things that we can do to engage with our customers?
I think I'll give you the top three. I think those are the most important ones. Once we get past that, so number one is an alignment with the brand, right? Aligning with the values and the purpose of the brand. Number two, and I don't know that these are necessarily in this order, but number two is around trust and building that trusted relationship, and not just trying to entrap your customers in every time you message them or you interact with them, right? So alignment, trust, and then I would say the third one that's really important is value delivered. What value are you delivering for your customers? Again, what problems are you solving for them? How are you helping them achieve the jobs that they need to do, and delivering value and impacting them in that way? So I think those are the top three things that really help to drive customer engagement.
Well, I have always said that we need to be able to measure what we do. If we want to gain grounds or if we want to improve, we have to be able to measure things. Any matrices that you think are critical in this effort to make sure that we are engaging with our customers? What key measurements should we be using?
Yeah, I think there's, it depends on your business too. It depends on what's important to your business and where you focus. But I do believe that, customer satisfaction, looking at retention, looking at likelihood to recommend, the number of actual referrals that customers do for the business. It's, customer lifetime value. And you're looking at, retention numbers, you're looking at revenue numbers, that kind of thing. And those are the important ones. I think, again, it's going to vary by business, and it's going to vary by the things that your business focuses on.
Fair enough. Well, thank you, Annette. Let me hand it over to Sam for a few questions, and I'll be back with you in a moment. Sam.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Yes, Annette, I might be repeating what Abby has been asking you, because it seems to be rolling about customer experience. But it reminds me of a little bit story about I think it was one of the big amusement parks where they tried to find out what are the customers' choices on their meals when they're going into the amusement park. So they said, we want to have a salad, but in reality the customer is ordering burger and fries. So what would be then the way to really understand that what is actually what the customer wants? And what they're really going to, gives me the feeling that maybe we should have a vegan hamburger, which is actually what they wanted. But but my question really is that how the difficulty really is to find out what they really want. Is there a way to, particularly in the hospitality, we tend to look at the metrics of thumbs up, or we're looking at the stars and great stay, but it doesn't tell us anything else. But what more is it to it to find out what the customer wants? Very broad question, but if you can touch on that topic, please.
No, it's okay. It's a simple answer too. It's a common theme here, which is you have to listen to your customers. You have to talk to them. You can't really understand them without doing that. And so, listening to customers is really, I'll just focus on that because, in my book, I talk about the three ways to understand your customers. And that's absolutely critical here. But I'll focus on the first one and we'll go from there. It's about listening. And listening is really about asking them. You know what? You'll never know what your customers' wants or needs or expectations are without talking to them. You can't just sit around in the office and just everybody sort of brainstorms on, hey, we think we know what our customers want or need or whatever. You actually have to go and talk to customers. So when I talk about listening in the book, I talk about listen, ask, and capture. Listen is about, surveys. I'm sorry. Listen is about, wherever the customer wants to leave feedback. And that might be online reviews or social media or telling your employees. So that's voice of the customer through the employee. Ask is quite simply, surveys or interviews or those kinds of things. And then the third component there is capture. And capture is about the breadcrumbs of data that customers leave behind as they interact and transact with your brand. So in your example, when you go at the end of the day to look at what customers are buying and you see that they're buying burgers and they're not buying salad, that's capture, right? That's the data that you need to look at as well, in conjunction with the feedback that they provide you, and marry all that data together to have a really good understanding of, what they want, burgers or salads.
Okay. Then in hospitality, we always talk about this documenting every touch point and creating that customer journey. How important is that to be so finicky about getting everything right, or should we be looking at more at the whole picture when we're creating that customer journey?
No, you absolutely need to map your customer journeys. And what that entails is looking at some point A to point B, whether it's making their reservation to go into the park. So we'll stay on that theme, making the reservation to go into the park. It's entrance, paying and that experience. It's, waiting in line for a ride. It's waiting, and ordering food, whatever it is. Pick some scope, pick some interaction that the customer has with the brand and map it. And what you want to capture is what the customer is doing, thinking, and feeling, right? You absolutely need to do that. This is one of the most important tools and processes when it comes to understanding the experience today and designing a better experience for tomorrow. So it is a process. It's not just about the map. The map ends up becoming this pretty picture on a wall that really isn't useful to anybody. It is a process. You've got to not only map the current state and the future state, with the ideal experience for the customer, with the customer. All this is done with the customer. But then you also have to create a service blueprint. And this is done internally. It's the people, the tools, the systems, the processes, the policies that support and facilitate the experience that the customer is having. And those maps are created internally with your employees because we really want to understand what's happening behind the scenes and fix what's happening behind the scenes so that the customer can have a better experience as well. And by the way, the employees will have a better experience too, because now we're looking at what they're doing and what tools and systems and policies and processes they're working with day to day to deliver that experience for your customers.
My last question is about the execution. How critical is it to besides getting the line staff who's going to be excited about this and the middle management, but really looking at the big guy on the top of the pyramid who may have how excited does he have to be for and committed that makes things work in these kind of customer journey creations?
Absolutely. Your CEO, whether it's a man or a woman, needs to be on board 110%. They've got to be committed, because if they are not committed to the work that lies ahead, if they don't get it, that the customer is, needs to be at the center of the business, then you will have a tough time getting the resources, whether it's human, financial, capital, time, whatever it is. You will have a really tough time getting what you need to do the work, to execute, to, improve the experience. And then it flows from there, right? It's not just the CEO, but all of the executives need to be aligned on this. This is a department, enterprise-wide effort. It has to happen across the entire organization. It can't just happen in one department or another, because what that ends up doing is creating a choppy, experience for the customer, and which is really confusing. It doesn't align with the brand, and it's just not a good experience for customers.
Okay. Well, thank you, Annette. And back to you, Abid.
Well, Annette, you talked about that the senior leadership has to be on board, otherwise the resources won't be allocated, there will not be a buy-in, and it is a tough enough thing anyhow, much less dealing with internal issues.
Right.
Talk about best ways to align everybody around the customer-focused capabilities. How do we develop that in the organizations?
Well, this is a whole conversation in and of itself. How much time do we have? So there's the shorter answer that I'll give you is this. When you go to your executives to get these, get this commitment and this alignment, you've got to do a couple of things. You have to appeal to the left and the right side of their brain, right? You have to appeal to that number side, that analytical side that wants to see data. They want to see ROI. They want to see, what does this mean for us? And then you've got to appeal to the left side of the brain, which is the right side of the brain, the emotional side, by telling customer stories, bringing customers in, having an immersion program, getting executives out there, sort of an undercover boss kind of project or program. The journey maps, having them sit in on the journey mapping sessions and really hearing and seeing what pain they put their customers through to interact with the brand, So that's a really important thing, is you have to build the story, and you've got to tell the story, and you've got to do it by appealing to both the left, the logical, numeric, data-driven side of the brain, and the right, the creative, emotional side of the brain. And that's how you're ultimately going to win them over.
Well, I think that would be critical, because I believe all organizations struggle with that. All organizations struggle with getting everybody aligned to make sure that we do stay focused on that end result, because all these demands are tugging at every person that works in the organization, but also from profitability point of view.
Well, here's what I'll say to address that. So it's interesting you say that all these demands are tugging at people, but when we focus on customer experience, we have to remember two things. Number one, without the customer, we have no business, right? And number two, when we talk about improving the customer experience, it's not necessarily about more work being piled onto people who are already busy. It's about doing things more effectively and more efficiently, so that ultimately everybody achieves the outcomes that they're trying to achieve.
Very good point. Though, generally speaking, every time a program is launched, the general consensus in the organization is, oh, here we go, one more thing to do. And is it really going to be followed up on or not? But that's a very good point. And then the customer experience and customer service, a lot of times are used interchangeably. Is it the same thing? Is there a difference?
No, they are absolutely used interchangeably, and they're used incorrectly. So customer experience is the sum of all the interactions that a person has, that a customer has with the brand over the life of the relationship with that brand, and probably more importantly, the feelings, the emotions, and the perceptions that they have about those interactions. Customer service is just one of those interactions, right? I like how Chris Zane with Zane Cycles up in Connecticut differentiates between the two, right? He says, and I sort of adapted what he says. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but it's basically service is what happens when the experience breaks down. Service is what happens when the experience breaks down. So if we get the experience right, we really reduce the load on our contact center and all of that sort of service recovery work, versus, so designing the experience is proactive versus customer service is really reactive.
Well, I must confess, I've never thought of a service in the terms that you defined it, but it does make sense that service happens when the experience breaks down. So I'll have to remember that. It really does make sense. One last question, if I may, Annette, before we bring our next guest in. Developing the customer experience strategy. How do we begin? How do we embark on that process? Because it is all too daunting.
Yeah. Yeah. I have sort of these building blocks of a customer experience strategy. And really what we have is this foundation that really starts with, we've already talked about leadership, executive commitment and alignment, a culture, customer-centric culture. Culture is core values plus behaviors. So we've got our core values, including some that are customer specific. We then need to socialize and operationalize the values and the associated behaviors. We need to listen to our customers. We need to make sure our employee experience is a great experience. We've got to have a governance structure in place. So these are some of the key foundational elements that have to be in place to get started. And most of the time, when someone reaches out to me and they're saying, "Hey, we need to do this," if it's not somebody at the executive level, if it's somebody maybe down a level or two who's saying that, they're coming to me to ask me to help them build the business case. And so we start with what I call like a skunk works project, right? So we'll listen to customers, we'll identify where some pain points are, we'll go through what recommendations for improvements. We'll make those improvements and then take a look at the ROI and get that in front of the executives to say, "Hey, here's what happens if we focus on the customer experience more broadly." This is just one example, one small project or one small initiative, but imagine how this would look if we rolled it out more broadly. And so, I've done that with clients over the years. And one of my favorite ones is an insurance company where they ended up, in the contact center, saving at-risk customers and really at the same time saving $11 million worth of revenue just in that 1 year. So again, imagine if you blow that out to the larger organization, the impact that you can have there.
Well, that's fabulous. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a great segue for us to bring in our next guest. Please stay with us. We'll have you back in a moment. But Sam, let's bring Ed Morrison up because he is the guru of strategy. So Ed, the very first question I have to ask you, was it the Capitol Hill that drove you to strategy, or was it the private sector?
It was a little of both. Both of those are very complex environments. And what I learned was the old ways of doing strategy that I learned in business school really just didn't work very well. So we had to come up with a new approach to strategy in these complex environments.
So talk a bit about that. What really is the customer experience strategy and how is it best defined?
Well, let's talk about the term strategy first. Annette did a wonderful job explaining to us what customer experience is all about. But too often we don't focus on the word strategy. What is that? And the way to think about strategy in complex environments is that it answers two questions. Where are we going and how will we get there? So until you have an outcome that has some measurable characteristics so that we know where we're going, and until you have a path that helps define how you're going to get there, you don't really have a strategy. And what I'm going to suggest to us is that strategy is actually in these more complex environments actually become a matter of following simple rules. So we deal with the complexity by following some simple rules, and we deal with the complexity by focusing on one dimension of management that's too often ignored, and that's our conversations.
Well, conversations are easy said than done, particularly the meaningful conversations that would lead to some good results. Talk a bit about how we can best develop the customer experience strategies. How does a conversation begin? What kind of conversations are we meant to be having?
So I'll introduce you to the idea of a strategic conversation. So as I've said before, strategy helps us define where are we going? What's the customer experience that we want to design? And then secondarily, how are we going to get there? What are the projects, or as Annette talked about, the initial Pathfinder projects or skunk work projects or learning launches? that we're going to engage in to start designing that new customer experience. In order to do that, I would argue that we have an opportunity to diffuse throughout our organizations and throughout our networks the capacity to conduct strategic conversations. By that meaning conversations that answer these two questions: where are we going? How will we get there? So what we've learned in our work with complex environments is that these strategic conversations have an underlying structure. They're guided by questions. The first question is, what could we do? What could we do with the assets we already have? What could we do with the experiences that we are already producing? The knowledge that we already have in our organization, in our partners, with our customers. What could we do? Then the second question is, of all the things we could do, what should we do? And here again, the realities that Annette talked about terms of ROI, the possibility of creating more impact, and focusing, frankly, on the things that are doable, things that we could do without too much, that have a high leverage, that we don't have to work too hard to get done. There are a lot of opportunities in today's organizations to find those leverage points. Then the third question is, what will we do? What are we going to do now to start moving our ideas into action? And then the last question touches on the whole point that Annette was raising, which was the continuous process. When are we coming back together again on a regular basis to figure out what we've learned and what we're going to do next? So I'm going to suggest to you that strategy is not this episodic event which happens every 3 years or 5 years or 1 year. It's not a stale budgeting exercise. It's a set of conversations that we can diffuse throughout our organizations about where we could go and how we could get there. And if we train people in how to have these conversations with our customers, we'll get a much richer understanding of what the customer experience could be.
But Ed, at least in my limited experience in this field, strategy is typically thought of a conversation you might have at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year, and then for the next year or so you covered because you documented what you did. Most of the organizations operate under that notion. Where have we gone wrong?
Well, strategy is an ongoing process. A strategy process should be reviewed or renewed around every 30 days in the sense that we're learning things that we want to capture. To another point that Annette was talking about is the importance of capturing what we're learning. So you can design a process using the simple rules of strategic doing or agile strategy, and you can design this process so that you have regular check-ins. I'll define strategy in this way. When I was a corporate strategy consultant in the 1980s, I was 30-something working for big companies like General Electric. I got on a plane, and a Hewlett-Packard executive who was easily 20 years older than I was said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a corporate strategy consultant." Of course, I thought it was a big shot. And he said, "Well, corporate strategy, that's actually fairly easy." And I said, "No, it's not." And he said, "Well, don't get me confused. Corporate strategy is where are you going and what's your next step?" And when you really boil it all down to the definition that I talked about, that's really what strategy is. And we have to define our next steps regularly so we can have strategic conversations and a strategic framework that we design and guide in a matter of hours. It's not a long analytic exercise anymore. There's a huge amount of knowledge embedded in our organizations that we don't take advantage of, primarily because we don't engage in these strategic conversations. We don't have disciplined conversations that focus us on taking ideas and moving them into action so that we can learn what's going to work. And we don't do that. And as a consequence, most strategies that are developed either sit on the shelf or become stale budgeting exercises, when in fact strategy now is an exciting part of everyone's job in the organization.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Ed. If you look at that process and look at the customer journey, how do we identify patterns that then can lead to different innovation, or really talking about the next steps that would yield some phenomenal results and exceptional experiences?
Well, I think the the patterns emerge from our conversations that we have, but I would argue that part of our problem has been that we've aligned strategy to a certain segment or tier in our management structure. We think of top management essentially coming up with a strategy, and everybody else is supposed to execute the strategy. This is an old industrial model that really doesn't work in the network age very much. Doesn't engage our employees, and certainly, as Annette pointed out, if you don't engage your employees, you're not going to engage your customers very well. So the challenge is guiding these conversations, and this is a top management job, inviting these conversations to happen, teaching people how to have these conversations, providing them the skills and the opportunities to have these conversations, and to diffuse this capability throughout the organization. In order to design new customer experiences, we can't rely simply on top executives, because they only have one view, one perspective, and perhaps it's not even the most effective perspective. As again, Annette is talking about the importance of undercover bosses and getting the top executives out into the world. You can have a strategic conversation, and it can be 15 minutes long. And it can be with customers, it can be with suppliers, it can be with your partners. If you're working with partners, you can define the customer experience much more aggressively and much more holistically in that way. And again, this is not a huge commitment of resources, because it's all about designing and guiding these conversations to give us opportunities to come up with measurable outcomes that we can start to measure, as you point out. This is all important. But in order to move this forward, we have to come up with ideas that we can move into action. And so, to Annette's point, the skunk works, the pilots, the idea of learning launches or Pathfinder projects, figuring out what we could do together to enrich that customer experience. You can't analyze the data to get you there. There's not enough data that will get you there. And in fact, most of the data, you're looking in the rear view mirror. You're not presenting yourself moving forward. And so that's why these conversations are critically important. And you can design a strategy process for your organization, much like you would snap together Lego blocks to enable that conversation to happen. And it's through those conversations that alignment emerges, because people start to understand where are we going and how will we get there, because you've engaged them in this conversation.
Well, that's fabulous, because most of the time the data that is available to us is historical. It has happened, it's done, it's over with. Very seldom do we look at the predictive indices. Half the times it's not available, and if it is available, we don't believe in it. So I think with the data analytics and technology improving, hopefully that'll improve along with it. Ed, let me turn it over to Sam at this particular point, and I'll be right back with you. Sam.
Thank you. Very interesting, this discussion about strategy. I want to discuss a little bit about the customer journey and ask you about how do we identify patterns in customer journey that will drive innovation. What discussion is taking place in that theme?
Yeah, I think the idea of, because of the complexity of the customer journey, the idea of customer journey maps is very valuable. When we're dealing with complex environments, we need a visual language. So starting to map this out is important. But I want to draw and underline a couple of points that Annette made. The map is, in and of itself, is just an artifact of a conversation that you've had about customer journey. It's again kind of a balance sheet that's static in time, and unless it's continuously renewed, unless it's continuously updated, it becomes itself stale. It becomes somewhat of a prison to your thinking. It doesn't enable you to start thinking about this in a broader way. Sharing your maps with other partners, your customers, your employees, your partners, your suppliers, to get their version or their understanding of the map is important. Recognize that we're all looking at reality through our own straw. Everybody has their own perspective. No single perspective is the correct perspective. And the best customer journey maps are going to come from networks of trusted people who work together to trust each other in conversation, who listen to each other, and design new maps as you go forward. So without those customer journey maps, it becomes very complex. I'll tell you a story for just a minute. 15 years ago, when I was trying to put my ideas about Agile strategy on paper, I walked into my wife's lab, cancer research lab at the Cleveland Clinic. Now, she's a molecular biologist and she does cancer research. And up on the wall was a diagram. It was a picture of signaling pathways. She was talking about apoptosis, which is natural cell death. And it suddenly occurred to me that what she was trying to do was understand networks and pathways that she couldn't see because they were so small. When you start talking about customer journey maps, you're trying to understand networks and pathways that are so big and complex that you can't see them either. So part of the challenge is recognizing that this isn't rocket science. It's actually harder than rocket science. It's more like molecular biology. It's more like trying to come up with maps that we can agree on that will help us understand how do we deliver more value to our customers at a better through better collaboration. And that in and of itself is important. So I think these visual maps are critically important to understanding how we can improve those customer experiences. And I think the maps become a way of marking or capturing the complexity of our conversations as we go forward.
Yeah, okay, very good. Could you talk about the value of understanding the performance gaps in customer experience and how that helps the strategy?
Yeah, so performance gaps are happening when we've missed essentially the customer expectations are there, and we've not been able to meet those expectations. So, for example, personalization. When we don't personalize a service enough sufficiently, and a customer is expecting a personalized service, and we just give them a commodity service, then we've created a gap. So the question is, what could we do to improve our personalization? How do we work together with our customer, with our employees, with our customers, and potentially with our suppliers, for example, our IT suppliers or our social media suppliers, people who are supporting our work? How do we do that? How do we improve that customer experience? And also recognizing that the gaps can occur because we're dealing with complexity, complex environments. The gaps can be all sorts of different kinds of gaps. They can be physical gaps. They can be emotional gaps. They can be economic gaps. There are all sorts of different types of gaps that we have. We're dealing with an environment that's constantly shifting. The consumer itself, their interests and expectations are constantly shifting. The environment in which we operate is constantly shifting. So the idea that we can't keep up with this is simply wrong. The way in which we do that is, again, through structured, disciplined, focused, action-oriented conversations, which I call strategic conversations.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me hand over now to Abid to follow up with any further questions with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Every organization, at least that I know of, they always talk about importance of staff and guest engagement. They always talk about innovation culture. Actually, there are positions that have been created that their sole responsibility might be that. But yet we have varying degrees of successes. Talk a bit about what can we do, the strategies to foster innovation and strategies to foster the staff and guest engagement.
Well, part of it can be as simple as this. When we were introducing these concepts to Amgen over in the Netherlands, the top management asked me that question, how can we engage the staff? And I asked them, well, how do they communicate with staff currently? And they said, well, we have a monthly meeting where we essentially have the top management. It's an all hands meeting. We stand up there. We tell the staff the information that we want them to have, and we try to encourage them to get engaged and aligned. And I said, well, you're talking at people. You're not having a conversation. So one of the ways to do this is not have an all hands meeting where the top management is standing in the front of the room and talking to people, but rather convene small scale conversations with 8 people at a table, have top management there at the table, present possibility or a hypothesis about what we could do together and explore it. In 30 minutes, you'll come up with some great ideas that you could start to test right away. So part of this is just understanding that communication that we talk about, that and innovation is everyone's job now. Conversation matters, and it seems somewhat paradoxical that conversation becomes the critical dimension of this. But in 1993, in the Harvard Business Review, the Alan Weber, who's the founder of Fast Company magazine and was a Harvard Business Review editor at the time, wrote a very important article called "What's So New About the New Economy?" And he was talking about the notion of knowledge and how knowledge happens in our community, in our companies. And what he pointed out was that in our companies where knowledge is so critical, what matters to the customer? How can we address these? These are all implicit knowledge questions, knowledge that we don't have a grasp of yet. In order for us to gather that knowledge, to focus that knowledge, and to actually do something to create new value, we have to have conversations. So the conversation itself becomes a critical skill for management to design and guide in order to generate and distribute knowledge throughout the organization. Now, that's the focal point of our work in strategic doing, is teaching people the fact that these strategic conversations are a set of skills. They're a portfolio of skills that we can learn and we can practice and we can improve on. It doesn't cost a lot of money, just improves the skills. And what you see are step change improvements in productivity because people are aligning. People are starting to stop wasting time at meetings. They're stopping, to stop arguing about issues. And most importantly, they stop going to meetings that have no action connected to them. So part of the challenge, I think, here going forward is changing the way in which we think about strategy, distributing that relationship, that conversational relationship much more broadly throughout our organizations and with our customers and with our suppliers, and recognize that as we do that, we will design more valuable experiences because the human capacity to innovate is there. It's just we've suppressed it in our organizations too much.
Well, Ed, that is fabulous. I've got lots and lots of questions. Please stay with us. We'll have you back in a moment. But at this point, I think it would be a fantastic segue to Peter Ricci, if I may bring him on board. You talked about the knowledge dissemination, and we talked about staffing and employees. Peter, you heard both Annette and Ed talking about employee experience. Ed also talked about educating. As an educator, as a person who looks after the hospitality program, talk about schools' role in developing future leaders of this industry so that they can deliver to the customer expectations that we have in the industry today.
Well, thank you for having me. And, this is a very challenging, unique time because for the past decade, actually maybe 15 years, a lot of higher ed programs have been moving into the business school model where there are more courses in finance and accounting and marketing and organizational behavior and more metrics so that students coming out would be able to understand that yes, we are a people business through and with and about people, but we need to have a bottom line incorporated. And so the more vocational historical type programs have faded, and there's been a big movement in college education for hospitality in the business school model. Now, the pandemic kind of immediately changed the dynamics of our workforce and enrollments. In a very short time, the enrollments have gone down across the country. The workforce is leaving the industry like never before because the pandemic gave them an opportunity to see other jobs, see other industries, and kind of take a break from the day-to-day of the heavy guest employee interaction, which is tiring. They've never had this break. So as I sit here today, it's June 9th, 2021. I'm at a program that had 15 years of year over year steady growth, steady placement. And overnight, we're down 30 or 40%. And most every school is nationally down to some extent, to the point where some schools have closed. So to come out of the pandemic with a mad dash back to travel, the customers are seeking the experience that Annette was talking about and that we built up and led toward going into the pandemic. And yet we don't have the staff right now. So it's a very strange time to be living and working in this industry, especially from the viewpoint that I have running a hospitality program. We had a very unique situation where we had a certificate during COVID and we had global takers from over 160 countries, and they started giving us their feedback on the industry and telling us that they were going to leave because they had found all these other possible things to do with their lives. And at first, I really kind of brushed it off. And then we heard it more and more and more to the point now I'm seeing it in action. There are employers here where I am in South Florida, desperate for talent. I've heard it's similar in most part of and the service experience, the journey, the quality, the value, everything. So it's a very interesting time to be chatting with both of you.
Peter, you bring up a great point. The industry was at best at odds in being able to retain the talent. Pandemic has made that worse. Uh, what can be done under the current circumstances, A, to retain, to attract, and then B, retain the talent? With the enrollments down 30 to 40%, as you outlined, that means the talent pipeline is going to be pretty thin. So, yet again, it will be a bigger issue than it is today. What can we do to attract and retain the talent that is needed?
I honestly think with my history working in the industry and especially in the hotel sector, I think every crisis we've had in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, we've always tried to be more efficient afterward. And we've taken a further and further step back from the workers. So I think going forward, this is a perfect time for the industry itself to soul search. People are asking for more work-life balance that they had a few decades back in our industry, better benefits, and yes, more pay, but not to the brink of we can't operate a business with profit if we go move the pendulum too far. So I think any employer that steps forward and indicates that they're a good place to work, that they respect you, that they do have work life balance, yet they have the fun and enjoyment that we all love in hospitality, they're going to lead out of the abyss of the pandemic and they're going to be the ones that will do well earlier and they'll do well longer because they're already on the right footing. And, as you probably have seen in the media, Chipotle took a giant first step and they raised their starting wages. They also mentioned that they're raising their prices to consumers. So some companies are going to take this leap and others won't. But I've never seen the number of individuals leaving our industry as I have in the past 3 months. Just yesterday on Bloomberg, there was an article saying that hotel and restaurant workers are quitting at the highest rate in history in a 1 month period, which was May 2021. So it's beyond us talking about it. And it's really at the time that we have to do something about it because whether you're an economy product or a luxury product, you still have a baseline of service to fulfill through your employees and your internal guests. And if we don't listen to them, like Annette said, and I wanted to applaud her as soon as I heard it. Without customers, we have nothing. That's a saying I say every week in my guest service class. I start off that class every week saying, if we don't have guests, we have nothing. We have no payroll. We have no reason to be here. We can't pay electricity. And a lot of CEOs and a lot of leaders have forgotten that and get so mired down in the bureaucracy that it's time to get back and listen to the frontline workers, because they are really delivering the product and the service much more than we are. So, to answer your question, I think soul searching is where we're at, and finding the balance of the pendulum somewhere in the middle.
So, there has always been a lot of customer focus, and I must confess, there has been a lot of conversation on employee satisfaction as well. Whether that's pure rhetoric or not, that's to be debated, and we'll have a more conversation on that. But talk about some of the innovations that must transpire, that must happen now relative to addressing the new talent pool expectations as it relates to work.
I think we need to meet them where they are. As just one example, hotels have always arbitrarily had a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. shift and a 3 p.m. to 11 and so on. That doesn't work for today's workers who can go drive Uber or work at a call center that's open 24 hours and pick and choose their schedules that they prefer. We've mandated things on them versus letting them have input. Also, our benefits. We've decided what works for the employees versus maybe instead having a certain dollar amount per month where they could pick from daycare or tuition reimbursement or medical insurance or maybe saving towards a vacation. I think we could use the same types of resources and be very innovative, but we've just been kind of stodgy and repetitive in what we've done. And you mentioned employee climate surveys, or however you want to call them, employee internal checks. It tickles me, and not in a positive way, whenever I go to a meeting and they're passing around their recent employee climate survey and they're all applauding because they hit 80%. That's not really what you strive for. So there is a disconnect between what we think is good enough to keep the workers showing up versus what we should do to get them to come back to our industry. Right before this session, I was listening to the news, and they were interviewing a restaurant tavern owner in Kansas who was blaming all of his cooks for wanting their wages to go up. They didn't want to come back to work because they had all found jobs outside of his restaurant during the pandemic for higher wages, and he was blaming them. Well, we really have to stop and say, okay, if all these other industries are offering different schedules, different kinds of benefits that might appeal to different workers, then we need to change as an industry, not the workers. Otherwise, they wouldn't be stampeding out in the thousands that they are. It would be much smaller numbers, and then I wouldn't worry about it as much.
Fair enough. Peter, let me turn it over to Sam here for a bit, and I'll be back with you in a moment. Sam.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you, Abid. Yes, Peter, I mean, this is this ongoing discussion that we have had in several shows about this challenge of what is the best way and how can we attract the new generation of leadership. Is there something perhaps in the let's put it this way, in the curriculum in the school that we should look at that gives a spark for the students that are joining, that they see that, hey, there's a path not only for have the next job, but maybe there's a transformational that matches their values and what they want from life. Just remember from when I graduated from university, I mean, I was just happy getting a job as a management trainee, and I thought I will never change a company, but I think the mindset probably have changed quite a bit since that time. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And I think, again, one thing I really like about the business school model of hospitality is that while our major is hospitality, the degree is business administration. So they can take the skills that are useful in our business and go anywhere. I was at a meeting yesterday with the leader of the local destination marketing organization, and he said these exact words. It's time for us to maybe not expect them to work with our same company for 10 years, but to bring us those great people skills, and then we can spark them to become entrepreneurs, to go work in banking, to work in a related field, maybe retail or grocery chains. And that's also a lot of what happened during the pandemic is there was a new found revival of, hey, I have these great skills that could work in insurance sales or real estate and so on. Again, I want to focus on hospitality because it's the love of my life. I started at 14 years old. And I tell the students it's a passion, but it can be a passion that you can take in any which way. So I think in the curriculum, having classes in entrepreneurship, having classes in management that are general so they can see different career pathways beyond just a restaurant or a hotel or a convention center. And also, I find that in our intro to management classes in the hospitality department, that most students are amazed just to find out all the variety of jobs within our industry. Most of us in the industry are at fault ourselves because we've siloed into just hotels or just restaurants or whatnot. But they can work for a tour operator or Expedia or an airline or a charter boat company. There's so many opportunities. So young people like the idea that they can have some control over their path and be entrepreneurial in spirit. So that's kind of one of the things in the curriculum with us and the curriculum across the country that I think is important. Because in our time, Sam, we went to school specifically very grateful to get that manager in training job, thinking we were going to work for Ritz-Carlton or Carnival or whatever it was for our career. They absolutely don't think like that any longer. They experiment with multiple jobs during school just so they can get a feel for the world. And I think that's better. I think it's a better way to explore.
Yeah, and I think we should be better in promoting the different kind of opportunities. Comes to my mind this opening as a TikTok officer or whatnot, because it might match their lifestyle and their interest outside work.
Correct. I agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Peter. Let me hand over to Abid for any final questions.
Peter, thinking back, you were talking about that we all got through school so that we could start management training program. I got into the hospitality waiting for the martini lunches. By the time I got there, there was no martini. There were no lunches, for that matter.
Yeah,
because it was straight on.
It's interesting you say that because the conversation these days is just so fascinating because we know people are going to always travel and every generation is going to want to travel more than the one before them. So it's up to us as an industry now just to solve this dilemma, but we always do. We always emerge from crises well. I just wish I had the answers. From these thousands of certificate takers, I can tell that it's somewhere around the idea of work-life balance, freedom, respect, and an increase in base pay. So I'd love to work with Ed on the strategy side because that's what the CEOs are trying to do now is find their way out of this abyss. And it's going to take some thinking and no better way than to ask them. We sit in the ivory tower and we talk among ourselves, but we really need to ask them, the people that are working for us.
Well, Sam, if it's okay, I think this will be a great time to bring everybody back together. And I'm going to go back to Annette for a second, if I may. Annette, talk about the employee experience. You've heard Peter talk about the challenges that are up against us. We all know that employee experience drives customer experience. What will it take? What do we need to do to really live that value? Annette, you're muted.
Of course I am. But I gave away all the secrets while I was muted too. So I forgot what I just said. So No, I think again, I have a short answer, right? When we think about designing the employee experience, we do the exact same things that we do when we design the customer experience, right? We have to take the time to talk to employees, to listen to employees, to really understand who they are and what matters to them and what's impactful to them and what value, what they're trying to get out of their work, where they want to go, those kinds of things. We need to map the employee, their journeys as well. So it's a lot of the same kind of work that we do to design the customer experience. It's just a different constituent. And I think it's important to know really what employee experience means, right? It's not the same as employee engagement. Employee engagement is outcome. It's not the same as employee happiness. Employee experiences definition is very similar to customer experience, which is the sum of the interactions that an employee has over the life of the relationship with their employer. And I like to add in there as well the enablers and the capabilities that are provided to the employee as well. And I'll explain that in just a second, as well as the feelings, emotions, and perceptions about all of that, right? So when I talk about enablers or capabilities, I'm talking about things like, I like to bucket them into the soft stuff and the hard stuff. The soft stuff is really the things that we expect when we think about, at least I do anyways, when we think about employee experience, which is, coaching and feedback and career pathing and leadership that's open and communicates and is honest and transparent, knowing how their work impacts the business and what value they add. They're empowered to do what they need to do. They're not micromanaged, right? They've got the support and the ecosystem that they need to do their jobs. The other part of the definition, or the other part of the sort of enablers that I like to talk about, is the hard stuff. And the hard stuff is the tools, the systems, the processes, the policies, the workspace, the workplace that allows them and allows them to do the job that they came to work to do. But also, as they tell me when I interview employees, is to serve the customer the way that the customer deserves to be served, right? And so if they don't have the tools, if they don't have the right training, if they don't have the resources, if they're working with outdated processes and policies, or broken policies, scripts that don't make sense to anybody, right? You can't have that personalized interaction if you're standing there, citing from a script, so you've got to think about all of those kinds of things when you think about the employee experience.
Well, thank you. Ed, if I may ask you, to Peter's point, and also we know where we want to go. Let's address the employee experience. Can you help us? How do we address it? How do we make it work?
Yeah, what I was going to suggest is that we can design strategic conversations that I've outlined. So imagine that our employees had the flexibility, we provided the flexibility for them to achieve work-life balance. What would that look like? That in and of itself is a framed strategic conversation. Or imagine that our company is an employer of choice for young people moving into this industry. What would that look like? So that's the conversation. And so how do you design that conversation in such a way? Well, you spend a little bit of time saying, what could we do? What could we do? Then we want to focus on, okay, of all the things we could do, what should we do? And here we look for the big easy, the big idea that's easy to do. We don't take the hardest thing to do to start out with. Figure out what that is, and then start to explain a little bit more about what does success look like. If we are the employer of choice, how do we measure that? What kind of experience, dimensions of the experience do we want to capture? Then we need to go to Annette's idea of the skunk works or the pilot. What are we going to do now to move us toward that preferred future? What project could we start on now, today, next week, that we could start to work on? And then what will we collectively do? This can't work if we just designate one person to do all this. No, we have to share this experience. We have to go out and say, what small step can we take? And typically in our work, we ask, in the next 30 days, what's 1 hour? What could you do in 1 hour of your time to start to move us in this direction? What's 1 hour that you could commit to help us move? And then when are we going to get back together again to carry on this conversation? Because we can't solve this overnight. We're not going to solve this overnight. It's going to be a continuous process of these conversations. So what could we do? What should we do? What will we do? And when are we getting back together again? Those 4 questions define a strategic conversation. You can frame it by suggesting this is the future that we want to get to. How do we get there?
Well, thank you, Ed. Peter, do you think the industry is ready for these kind of conversations, or are the conversations already occurring? Ed outlined a framework. We know what we have to do. You've talked about the challenges that are up against us. Do you think industry is ready, and are these conversations occurring now?
I'm 50-50 on that question. I think some people are honestly waiting for unemployment insurance to go away and expecting a mad rush of returned workers. Um, I have talked to some CEOs who are listening and have ears open and know that something has to be done. And I've talked to others that say I really shouldn't share the results of the survey so frequently because it makes the industry look bad. So right now I'm kind of on the fence, but any of us who's worked in this business for years, we know we've always been a high hours, low pay blamed industry with challenges for talent. So I think this just hyper escalated the problem and put it under the spotlight. So I'm trying to think of it as a great time to reframe. I wish Ed lived here and Annette lived here and we could go and do our rounds in front of CEOs, because somebody's going to buy in. And the first one who does buy in is probably going to come out of the abyss so much faster. I'm optimistic, you know? Let me tell you, I'm not going to pay luxury dollars for a hotel stay unless I get the experience that Annette is speaking of. So the guest is not likely to change as quickly as the workers have. And I really don't think they changed quickly. I think it's been building and building and building, and they had the chance now to express themselves in mass for the first time, you know?
You know, I had put up a quick survey, of just binary yes or no answer on what did people think whether the customer would experience service failures, and by and large, at least the limited responses that we had, I believe 70% of the people were saying absolutely. As we coming out of the industry, out of this pandemic, there are going to be disappointments on behalf of the customer because we not ready for the travel to kick in as fast, and we still sitting on the sideline. So we've talked about the staff, and it is a critical component. We know what industry initiatives can be launched in a relatively quick time period, and maybe there are other industries that we can learn from. What do we need to do to deliver better customer experience? And that, if you don't mind taking the lead, maybe 2 things that we can do.
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record, so I apologize for that. You can't do anything until you listen to your customers, really, until you understand what their needs and their expectations and what they're trying to do. That's really the bottom line. You can have all the initiatives in the world that you think will bring customers back or will strengthen the relationship or will keep them coming back. But unless you have taken the time to talk to customers and really understand what their needs and expectations are, you're just going to be spitting in the wind, right? Until you have that information. So you have to make these data-driven decisions, and that data has to come from your customers.
Well, Ed, if I may ask you, Annette had mentioned in the earlier conversation that service occurs when experience breaks down. Every company in the world that I know of has a customer service department, typically that where you get transferred to in another eternal hold before you talk to somebody about the complaint that you have. Does that mean that all the companies are doomed to fail?
Well, if the companies are doomed to fail if they don't understand that we now live in a network environment. If you get away from the hierarchical thinking that you can compartmentalize a problem by just creating a department to solve that problem, that's not going to work. And effectively, the value is created through our collaborations. Value is created through our collaborations. And whether that's with our customer or with our employees or with our suppliers or with our partners, the collaboration creates the value. And in order to collaborate, we need to have conversations. And unfortunately, we don't teach this in any of the schools that I've been involved with, is how to collaborate. We don't teach people how to collaborate because until recently, we really haven't understood that collaboration is all about designing and guiding conversations. And it's all about designing and guiding those conversations and leading by asking questions. Now it is possible, because we do know this, that we can teach these skills at scale. So for example, our lab is working with the province of Alberta, and we're working with the new administration in Ecuador to teach the skills of collaboration, because it's through collaboration that you create value in a knowledge economy. That's it. And unfortunately, you can't direct that. And our schools of management, I think, have been unfortunately slow in understanding this. And now I think we're starting to speed up. I think we're starting to understand that by teaching people how to have powerful conversational experiences, we can innovate. We can create new experiences for people. We can create the exact same thing that we want. Yep.
I think that is very encouraging, Ed, because I have been of the thought that we only are into monosyllabic text returns. So somebody asks you a question, the most you'll get back is yes or no. And it's very instantaneous return. There is no conversation that transpires. And if the future leaders are growing up in that environment, what challenges does that present? Because most of the conversations are occurring in one or two words or emojis at best, which a lot of us don't even understand.
This is one of the big paradoxes of the internet. The internet is our first interactive mass medium. Look at us today. We're having a conversation. We're located in 5 different places. It's our powerful medium. Yet we've allowed our conversational capacity, our capacity to ask compelling questions and to listen, as Annette was talking about, and to listen to each other. We've allowed that skill to degrade. We do that at a peril because we live in a knowledge economy, and it's through our conversations that we create and distribute knowledge. So unless we start to address this challenge, I don't think we can direct our way into the future. I don't think the old management styles will work. I don't think AI is going to solve the problem. I don't think data is going to solve the problem. Human interaction is critically important now. Deeper conversations are important. And the misconception that we have is that these deeper conversations take too much time. They're too slow. And it's quite the opposite. These conversations actually speed up our capacity to deliver innovative solutions. They speed up our ingenuity. Why is that? Again, going back to the point that was made earlier, it's because through our conversations, as we work together, we build trust, and trust powers the capacity to collaborate. And so when we do this, we accelerate, and this is the network effect you start to see in communities that start embracing this approach to economic growth, or clusters of companies that start embracing this. They start to understand that innovation happens through trusted networks. So if there's one takeaway I would say from this conversation is learn the skills of conversation, learn the skills of strategic conversations, and learn that you can lead those conversations simply by asking questions.
Very well said. Thank you for that, Ed. Sam, is there anything online? I know there were a bunch of activity for a bit, but is there anything online or any questions from you? Or should I continue to go? Because I can go for hours, and I know we're approaching the end of our session.
No, I think there's no further questions here from the viewers, but I'm just curious about what your views are, and on, we're talking about climate control and sustainability, which are some of the very important topics for the today's generation and for the children. And for the young adults who are now working in the profession, their children will be asking them, Daddy and Mommy, what are you doing about this? How should the industry react, first of all, to talk about this very burning issue, because it tends to be, yes, customer-centric, very important. Customer journey is very important. The return of investment, extremely important. But how about those topics that seems to be, I don't know how about it in the US, but in Europe, and particularly Northern Europe, those are very relevant topics which are dealt with when people are actually looking at jobs, what are the values of the company? Why should I work for you? Do we share the similar values? And so I just want to ask your thoughts about this. Maybe Annette, what do you think? And then maybe Ed and Peter.
Yeah, I'll just give a quick answer there. I think that you hit the nail on the head with, customers wanting to align with brands that, they align with in terms of values, purpose, corporate social responsibility, all of those kinds of things. And so and to Ed's point, we have sort of this microphone now with the internet and social media and everything, and people out there talking about the things that are important to them. And if brands aren't out there on social media as well, listening and hearing what they're saying and responding to that, I think it could be detrimental for sure.
Yeah, I'm going to defer my comments to Peter, because Peter's got his ear to the ground with students on climate change. But I'll circle back with some things that we're doing on that topic.
Yeah,
so Peter,
definitely,
please.
Sustainability needs to be a part of the curriculum, woven through, whether it's the food course or the hotel course or the cruise line course or the events course. I have several students in sustainable meetings and events groups and so on and so forth. So it's a popular thing among the younger generation. And like Annette said, they are looking to match their values where they go spend the majority of their life, which is at work. So it comes back to the current situation we had with COVID-19 and the pandemic. They realized that the workplace was not matching them as well as their family and their friends and their nieces and nephews who were in other industries. So that's a part of the reason that we had this mass exodus. And it's another call to action sound in the background for the leaders. Because if you think about it, since the 50s, when air travel took off and the hospitality industry really boomed, there has never been a time where people were stopped in their tracks from working with the guests for any length of time. This is the first time they could stop and think. Outside of 9/11 and and tsunamis and some other instances that were geographically limited, nobody really stopped in their tracks for this length of time and was immersed with their family and friends to hear about their other jobs and careers. And so, they are in touch with what companies are, right? A lot of talk about restorative justice, social justice, corporate social responsibility. Those are things I hear among the younger generation constantly. They want to match their lives with a place that their work life will be similar to them as much as possible.
I'm sure that the climate change issue will shape the next generation. And part of the challenge that we have now as leaders is training the next generation to come up with the ingenious solutions that we're going to need to address these climate change challenges. So part of this is understanding that our companies don't exist and our organizations don't exist in a vacuum. We exist in a network, in a collaborative network within our communities, within our regions. So the question is, what are we doing to build the partnerships so we can address collectively climate action? This is a very important challenge. And it's going to be those companies that start to understand that I'm not just a hospitality company or a hotel company. I'm a responsible corporate citizen within a regional economy. And at the region, we can actually do something to address climate change. We can do something to help do that. So how do my employees help? How do we help our employees engage outside our company? How do we as a company become partners with others that are addressing climate change? I think this is a fundamental question. We're now working with a company, right, a nonprofit company called GoingGreener.org. And Going Greener really is focused on overcoming our climate anxiety. the climate ain't recognized. So we understand that we've got this climate problem, but we're anxious about what do we do about it? How do we take action? And the truth of the matter is we take action with small steps. Yeah. We all take action with small steps. And if companies can take that leadership by taking these small steps and reaching out and understanding that it will be a critical defining issue for your ability to attract and retain workers, because that next generation is really going to be focused on, as we've already talked about, really focused on the climate change issue.
Well said. Thank you.
So one last question, if I may ask all three of you, put your future scopes on one thing that you think will be notably different in 5 years in our industry. Peter, if you wouldn't mind starting.
I think we'll pay better than we ever have before. I don't know how we're going to get there, if it's higher prices, but I think we will not be at the bottom in applicants' minds anymore for being the worst, because that's the biggest signal I've heard this past 24 months.
Thank you. Annette, your thought?
I'm just going to, echo and sort of build on that and say that I really do think that the focus on the employee experience is going to just be amplified over the next couple of years. And, I started my career, 30 years ago at J.D. Power and Associates. And at the time I kept talking to clients about, hey, we should be listening to employees and focusing on their experience. And, that fell on deaf ears. And finally, in the last few years, and especially in the last, year and a half, executives and brands have taken notice, and to Peter's point, there's going to be some changes going forward, and the fact that more brands, there will be sort of this groundswell of brands really just focusing on the employee and focusing on their experience, because they really have to.
Thank you. And Ed, you get the last word on this.
Well, I think like other industries, hospitality is going to go through a transformation in the way in which we think about our organizations, moving from hierarchical silos to more of a network-based organization. We're going to have leadership guidance that's going to require us to, again, design and guide new conversations about how do we create value. And we're going to have more open participation. We're going to have more engagement with our employees, with our customers, with our partners, with our suppliers. The companies that embrace this new approach to managing our organizations, they will thrive. They will be able to jump to this new S-curve, which we're talking about. The companies that don't, that stay, assume that it's all going to work out and they're going to be able to survive, well, welcome to Blockbuster. Welcome to Kodak. It's not going to work. And so I think the challenge right now is, how do you start some experiments to jump to this new S-curve that we're talking about, an S-curve that's really built off of knowledge and networks and a new approach to strategy?
Well, a fabulous, fabulous conversation. Thank you so much, Annette Franz, Ed Morrison, and Peter Ricci. Really appreciate your time and your insights. It has been a tremendous session. Thank you for being with us at Hospitality Talks. Over to you, Sam.
I also like to thank all the live viewers. We had Luminary Learning Company out of Vancouver, Mohammed Razib from Coconut Creek, Florida, RK, whoever you are, from London. Nice to have you with us. So thank you very much for joining, and all the rest who were joining our show, and also the replay viewers. We really appreciate that you're watching this show if you were not able to join us live. Now, if you like to listen to this as a podcast, it will be available on Hospitality Talks podcast channel. So there are many ways to enjoy the fabulous conversations with Hospitality Talks. So looking forward to seeing, thank you again, the panels. And Abid, great always hosting this with you. And looking forward to our next episode with another exciting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.